Poor girl revealed triplets, not knowing there are millionaires' missing children. Life shifts. Emily was only 24, yet life had carved into her the weariness of someone much older, and every morning before the sun had even risen, she tied her worn apron around her waist and prepared herself for another endless shift at the small-town diner where she worked, her tired hands carrying trays, pouring coffee, and smiling at strangers who never realized how heavy her heart was, for behind her warm smile lay a world of silent sacrifices that no one saw. And while the smell of fried food clung to her clothes, her thoughts were never in that diner, but always with her 3 children, Ethan, Ava, and Noah, who were only 4 years old, innocent little souls who waited for her in their small, rented room at the edge of town, a room barely large enough to hold their beds and a second-hand dresser. Yet to Emily, it was a castle, because it sheltered the only people who gave meaning to her life. And though she had little money, she gave her children everything she had, every ounce of her strength, every heartbeat of her love, every dream she once carried for herself. And while others her age enjoyed freedom, laughter, and plans for the future, Emily lived for the present moment of keeping her children safe, fed, and smiling, never once daring to wish for more because even simple survival required all her courage. And when she walked through town, holding the small hands of her children, she heard the whispers that floated like poison in the air. Whispers of judgment, whispers of gossip, whispers of pity, people asking each other where the father of those children had gone, people lowering their voices, but never enough to stop her from hearing. And though each word stung like fire against her skin, she chose silence, lifting her chin, smiling at her children, pretending the world around them was kinder than it truly was, because to her children she wanted to be strong, a mother who could protect them from every cruelty life threw their way. And at night, when she returned home after hours of serving ungrateful customers, her body aching, her feet swollen, and her uniform damp with sweat, she would unlock the door to that tiny room and be greeted by 3 small faces that lit up as though she were the most important person in the universe. And in those moments, all her exhaustion faded, replaced by a warmth that no wealth could buy, and she would kneel down, embrace them tightly, inhaling the scent of their hair, feeling their little arms wrap around her neck. And in that fragile embrace, she found the strength to wake up again the next morning and do it all over again, because their happiness mattered more than her pain, their laughter more than her tears, their future more than her present. And when she watched them sleeping under a thin blanket, curled up close to each other, she whispered silent promises that one day things would be better. One day she would give them a life, free from hunger and fear. One day she would prove that even a poor girl could raise her children with dignity, love, and hope. And though she often cried in the quiet darkness when no one was watching, she always wiped her tears before the dawn, for she refused to let her children see despair in her eyes. She wanted them to see light, to see resilience, to believe that their mother was unbreakable, even if inside she often felt fragile. And so Emily continued her struggle day after day, walking the fine line between exhaustion and determination, never allowing herself the luxury of rest, never asking for help, never bowing to the cruelty of others, because in her heart she carried a truth no one could steal. Her children were her entire world, her only reason to fight, her only reason to breathe, and no matter how hard life became, she would endure it all for Ethan, Ava, and Noah, the 3 little hearts who gave her the strength to survive. The night was colder than usual, heavy clouds pressing low against the sky as rain splattered across the cracked windows of Emily's tiny apartment. And while her children slept soundly after another long day, Ethan suddenly began to cough harshly, his small body trembling as fever burned through him. And Emily's heart pounded in terror because she had seen that look before, the frightening weakness in his eyes. And without hesitation, she wrapped him in the thinnest blanket they owned, lifted his fragile body into her arms, and whispered to Ava and Noah to stay inside and wait for her, promising she would return as quickly as she could. And then she ran through the storm, shoes soaking in puddles, hair clinging to her face, lungs burning as she pushed forward, clutching Ethan tightly to her chest, ignoring the cold that pierced her skin, her only thought being that she had to reach the city hospital in time, and after what felt like forever, she stumbled through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, her breath ragged, her arms trembling, begging the nurse for help, and within minutes Ethan was taken for examination, leaving Emily alone in the waiting area, drenched, shaking, and terrified, praying silently for her son's recovery. And it was in that same hospital on that very night that Richard, a man of 45, who carried the weight of grief in every step, entered the building for his routine checkup, dressed sharply in a tailored coat, yet with eyes that betrayed loneliness, for years had passed since the tragedy that stole his wife and triplet children from him. A wound that never healed, no matter how much wealth or power surrounded him. And as he sat in the quiet of the lobby, flipping through meaningless pages of a magazine, his gaze drifted absent-mindedly across the room until it landed on a young woman hunched forward in a chair, her hair wet, her clocked. He's clinging to her small frame, her face pale with fear, and in her arms rested a little boy with striking features that made Richard's chest tighten, features that were so painfully familiar they sent a shiver through him, and when the nurse called the boy's name, Ethan, Richard's heart skipped, because the sound carried echoes of names he had once whispered to his own children, and though he told himself it was impossible, his eyes could not look away. For the child's eyes mirrored the very same shade of hazel he had once kissed goodnight. And then, moments later, two more children rushed into the waiting room, Ava and Noah, who had followed Emily against her instructions, their small hands clutching each other as they searched desperately for their mother. And Richard rose to his feet in shock, his breathing uneven as he saw them clearly, because standing before him were not just children. They were living reflections of the faces he had lost years ago, the curve of their smiles, the tilt of their heads, the way their voices chimed together like music he thought he would never hear again. And though reason told him this could not be true, his heart pounded as though destiny itself had placed him in that hospital on this night, rain hammering against the windows while fate whispered that the life he had mourned was somehow standing only a few feet away. And in that charged silence, Richard's world shifted, leaving him trembling with both fear and desperate hope. Richard stood frozen in the hospital corridor, his mind spiraling as he tried to steady his breath. Yet no matter how many times he told himself it was coincidence, the pull in his chest insisted otherwise, and when Ethan was admitted for further care, Richard quietly asked a trusted physician, one bound to his family for years, to help him confirm the truth without alerting the young mother, and under the pretense of standard medical procedures, small samples were taken, details entered discreetly, and Richard waited with a pounding heart for the results that could either break him or restore a shattered piece of his soul. And as the days stretched on, he could think of nothing else. His business meetings blurred into background noise, conversations with his staff became hollow, for the image of those three children's faces haunted him in every quiet moment, and when at last the sealed envelope was placed in his hands, he found himself unable to open it immediately, fingers trembling as though the paper itself carried the weight of fate. And he retreated to his study late that night, the rain tapping softly against the tall windows of his mansion, his heart echoing with the memory of lullabies once sung to children he believed were gone forever. And with a deep breath, he tore the envelope open, scanning the lines once, then twice, his eyes widening as he read the undeniable truth. Those children were his, the DNA results aligning perfectly, leaving no room for doubt, no chance of error. And in that instant, a lifetime of grief collided with a sudden wave of hope so overwhelming that he sank into his chair, covering his face with shaking hands, whispering words to the empty room as if his late wife could hear. "They're alive. Our babies are alive." Meanwhile, Emily remained unaware of the storm gathering around her life, sitting by Ethan's hospital bed with Ava and Noah, curled against her, whispering reassurances to keep their small hearts calm. Until one afternoon Richard approached her, his eyes carrying an intensity she could not understand. And when he finally revealed the truth, showing her the document that tied their fates together, Emily's breath caught in her throat, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were reading, and she shook her head again and again, whispering, "No, this can't be true. This isn't possible." But the weight of the evidence pressed down on her until her body felt weak, and her greatest fear came rushing to the surface, the fear that someone would one day try to take her children away, and tears streamed down her face as she clutched Ethan's small hand, her voice trembling as she asked Richard, "What are you going to do to us?" Her entire world teetering on the edge of uncertainty, her love colliding with the terrifying reality that her children were no longer only hers. And in that fragile moment, her heart screamed silently that no matter what the papers said, no matter what truth was revealed, she would never let go of the three little lives that defined her very existence. Emily sat frozen in the hospital room, her fingers trembling as they clutched the edge of the thin blanket covering Ethan, and Richard's presence felt like a storm pressing into her small, fragile space, his eyes steady but not unkind, filled with an emotion she could not read. And though fear gnawed at her chest, she forced herself to meet his gaze, whispering with a voice barely strong enough to carry, "They are mine. They've always been mine." Yet Richard did not raise his voice. He did not argue. Instead, he sat across from her, folding his hands slowly, as if to show her that he meant no harm. And after a long silence, he asked gently, "Where did you find them, Emily?" And those words unlocked a flood of memories she had kept buried for years, her throat tightening as tears welled in her eyes. And she told him of that night when she was just 19, walking home past an old church on the outskirts of town, the wind howling, her body weak from hunger, when she heard faint cries that stopped her in her tracks, and as she searched in the shadows, she discovered a basket left abandoned near the crumbling steps, and inside it lay three tiny infants, their faces pale, their breaths shallow, their fragile bodies shivering as though clinging desperately to life. And she had knelt there in shock, heart racing, unable to understand how anyone could leave such helpless souls alone in the dark. Yet she could not walk away, for something deep within her told her that in that moment her destiny had changed, and with tears streaming down her cheeks, she gathered them into her arms, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. And from that night onward, she became their mother, giving up her own dreams, her education, her youth, working tirelessly to feed them, to keep them warm, to protect them from a world that had already shown them cruelty. And as she spoke, her voice cracked under the weight of years of silence, while Richard sat stunned, each word piercing his heart like glass, because the timeline, the details, the very image of those abandoned children matched the nightmare he had lived through, the night his triplets were stolen from his home, ripped from his arms in the chaos of a tragedy he could never forget. And though years of searching had yielded nothing, here before him was the missing piece of his broken life. Yet as gratitude swelled inside him, so too did anguish, for he realized they had not only been stolen from him but also abandoned, left to die in the dark. And only by some miracle, by Emily's courage, had they survived. And he bowed his head, tears filling his eyes, whispering almost to himself, "If not for you, I would have lost them forever." And Emily looked at him through blurred vision, uncertain whether his gratitude would be enough to spare her from losing the only family she had ever known, while Richard's heart split between grief for the years stolen, fury at the cruelty done to his children, and a deep, unshakable reverence for the young woman who had carried a burden that was never hers to bear, raising his children not out of obligation, but out of selfless love. The silence that followed Emily's confession hung heavy in the air, broken only by the soft beeping of the hospital monitor beside Ethan's bed, and Richard leaned back, his chest tight with emotions pulling him in opposite directions, his mind whispering of rights and justice, while his heart trembled with gratitude and confusion. And after a long pause, he drew a deep breath, his voice steady yet tender as he said, "Emily, I can give them everything you've ever wished for: security, education, a life without struggle, a future where they never have to face hunger or fear again." And though his words carried promise, Emily's face paled, her lips trembling as she shook her head, the dam inside her breaking as tears poured down her cheeks, and she whispered with a raw honesty that pierced the room, "I may not have given them life, but they are my life. I cannot breathe without them. I cannot exist without them. Her hands clutching the edge of the blanket as though holding onto the children themselves, her voice rising not in anger but in desperate love, a plea to be heard. And Richard's heart twisted as he watched her crumble, for never in his life had he seen such devotion etched so deeply into someone's very being. And though logic told him those children were his flesh and blood, his soul recognized that they had been carried by Emily's sacrifices, nurtured by her sleepless nights, protected by her tireless hands, and the weight of the decision pressed on him like an unbearable stone, because for the first time in years he felt alive again, felt the stirrings of fatherhood awaken in him. Yet to claim that role meant tearing apart the woman who had kept his children breathing. And the conflict raged silently within him, pushing and pulling until his composure nearly broke, and as the air thickened with unspoken pain, Ethan stirred weakly, his small hand reaching toward T. Both adults, his eyes half open, and Ava and Noah crept closer, their tiny faces caught between confusion and worry, and in the innocence of their voices they whispered together, "Please don't fight." Their little hands stretching out to hold both Emily and Richard, their fingers curling into theirs with the trust only children carry. And then, with a softness that silenced the storm in the room, the triplets looked up at the two adults whose worlds had collided so violently and said, "We want both of you." Their plea carrying more power than any argument, their pure voices shattering the walls of fear and pride, leaving Richard and Emily staring at each other, their eyes filled with tears, realizing that this battle was not theirs to win or lose, but theirs to resolve for the sake of the three small hearts who wanted nothing more than love without division. The hospital room was hushed after the children's innocent plea, and Richard sat in silence for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fragile little hands holding his. And in that fragile connection the decision formed, not from reason, but from love. And with a steady breath he turned to Emily, his eyes shimmering with sincerity, and he said softly, "I won't take them from you. I won't break the bond you've built. Instead, I want you with them, with me. You are the angel who returned my family to me." Emily's lips parted, disbelief flickering across her face, and for the first time since their confrontation, her fear eased, replaced by an overwhelming flood of relief that left her sobbing quietly as she leaned her head against Ethan's bed. And in that moment Richard's world shifted too, the walls of loneliness that had surrounded his mansion for years beginning to crack as he envisioned those children filling the grand halls with laughter, their small feet racing across marble floors, their voices echoing through the silence that had once consumed him. And when the day came for Emily and the triplets to step through the towering gates of his estate, the staff watched in awe, for never had they seen their master smile so freely, his eyes following the children with a joy that softened the sternness he once carried. And Emily walked nervously through the vast rooms, feeling out of place among chandeliers and golden frames. Yet everywhere she turned, the children's laughter made the space warmer, transforming the cold house into something it had never been before, a home. And slowly, Emily began to see that wealth was not what mattered, but the way Richard bent down to tie Noah's shoelaces, the way he carried Ava on his shoulders, the way Ethan clung to his hand as though he had always been there, and the tenderness in those gestures melted the walls around her own heart, building a bridge of trust between them. And as days turned into weeks, their bond grew deeper, not rushed, not forced, but blossoming in the quiet spaces of shared responsibility, shared smiles, and late-night conversations when the children had fallen asleep. And Emily discovered that beneath Richard's wealth and power was a man who had endured immeasurable pain, a man who now cherished every second of this second chance. And Richard discovered in Emily a strength he had never known, a selfless courage that humbled him, and together they rebuilt not only a family but also themselves, healing wounds with love that required no conditions. And the once lonely mansion now echoed with bedtime stories, with songs sung off-key, with the sound of children's laughter spilling out of every corner, until even the staff who had long lived in silence found themselves smiling at the transformation. And on a quiet evening, as the sun dipped beyond the horizon, Richard stood beside Emily on the balcony, watching the triplets chase fireflies across the garden. And in that golden light he turned to her, his voice low, his heart laid bare, saying, "I thought I lost everything, but you gave me back more than I ever dreamed. You gave me my children, and you gave me hope." And Emily, with tears glistening in her eyes, whispered back, "And you gave us a home." And as their hands intertwined, the weight of the past no longer held them down. For from pain had risen something stronger, something unbreakable, a family reborn not by chance but by destiny, a home filled not by wealth but by love, a life that would carry them forward together, forever.